When Jesus gave up his spirit on the cross, the world didn't remain silent. It was as if creation itself recognized that something beyond human understanding had just taken place. These events weren't random or merely natural. They carried powerful spiritual meaning. Each event spoke to the deeper significance of what Jesus accomplished through his death, impacting not only humanity, but the entire created order. Let's take a closer look at 6 key things that happened immediately after Jesus died, and how each one connects to the story of God from the very beginning. The earth shook and the rocks split. Creation's cry. Right after Jesus breathed his last breath, the ground trembled. Matthew 27:51 tells us, "The earth shook, the rocks split." This wasn't just a natural earthquake, it was a divine sign. The Creator had just died, and creation responded with a groan. In the Old Testament, we see something similar at Mount Sinai. When God gave the law to Moses, the mountain shook violently. Exodus 19:18. God's presence caused the earth to tremble. Now at the cross, something even greater had happened. The Son of God had fulfilled the law through his death, and the earth responded once again. The rocks splitting could also be seen as a symbol. In Hebrew thought, rocks were often connected with stability, strength, and even stubbornness. But here even the rocks felt what many hearts did not, the deep sorrow of heaven. Charles Spurgeon once said, "The rocks were more tender than the hearts of men." The same people who rejected Jesus remained unmoved, but creation itself could not hold back. This event reminds us that Jesus' death wasn't just for people, it affected the whole created order. Romans 8:22 tells us that all creation is groaning, waiting for redemption. At the cross, that redemption began. Tombs were opened, a glimpse of resurrection. Power, perhaps one of the most mysterious parts of Matthew's gospel, is what comes next. In Matthew 27:52-53, we read, "The tombs broke open. The bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many." This event isn't mentioned in the other Gospels, and it's easy to overlook, but it's packed with meaning. In Jewish tradition, the resurrection of the dead was something expected at the end of time. The fact that it happened here, even partially, shows that the end times were breaking into history through Jesus. Notice that the people who came out of their tombs are called holy ones. These were likely righteous people from Israel's past, faithful men and women who had trusted God. And now through the death of Jesus, they were brought back to life, not as ghosts, but with real physical bodies. This was not just a miracle, it was a message. Death is no longer the final word. This also brings to mind Ezekiel's vision of the dry bones in Ezekiel 37. God tells the prophet that he will bring his people out of their graves and give them life. Jesus' death is the fulfillment of that promise. He is the one who brings breath to the lifeless and hope to the hopeless. But notice the timing. They came out of their graves after Jesus' resurrection. This shows that Jesus is truly the first fruits of the resurrection. 1 Corinthians 15:20. Their rising was only possible because he rose first. His victory over death made resurrection possible not just for them, but for all who believe in him. The curtain tore in two, a new way to God. One of the most powerful and symbolic events happened in the temple at the very moment Jesus died. Matthew 27:51 says, At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. This was no ordinary curtain. It was the thick veil that separated the Holy of Holies, the most sacred part of the temple, from the rest of the building. Only the high priest could enter that inner room, and only once a year, to offer a sacrifice for the sins of the people. Leviticus 16. That veil represented the barrier between sinful humanity and the holy presence of God. It reminded the people that they couldn't just walk into God's presence on their own. They needed a mediator, a priest, a sacrifice. But when Jesus died, that veil tore, not from bottom to top as if man had done it, but from top to bottom. God himself was showing that the barrier was gone. Jesus, our perfect high priest, Hebrews 4:14, had offered the ultimate sacrifice, himself. Now through his blood, we can come boldly before God. Hebrews 10:19-20. This moment also fulfills a prophecy from Isaiah 25:7, which speaks of God removing the shroud that enfolds all peoples, the sheet that covers all nations. Through Jesus, the separation between God and humanity was removed, not just for Israel, but for all nations. Think about that. For centuries, people had to stand at a distance, watching as the priest entered behind the veil. Now, because of Jesus, the way is open for every man, woman, and child to walk into God's presence through faith. The torn veil is an open invitation, not just to visit, but to belong. Darkness at noon. Creation mourns its creator. Matthew 27:45 tells us, "From noon until 3 in the afternoon, darkness came over all the land." 3 hours of darkness in the middle of the day while Jesus hung on the cross. This wasn't just bad weather or an eclipse. Passover always took place during a full moon, making a solar eclipse impossible. This darkness was supernatural. It was as if creation itself was mourning. The sun, which normally gives life and light, turned away in silence. In the Old Testament, darkness often represented judgment. Think of the 9th plague in Egypt, when darkness covered the land for 3 days. Exodus 10:21-23. That plague came just before the death of every firstborn, and now as Jesus, the firstborn over all creation, Colossians 1:15, dies, darkness falls again. Amos 8:9 had prophesied this moment. "In that day, declares the sovereign Lord, I will make the sun go down at noon and darken the earth in broad daylight." That's exactly what happened. But this darkness wasn't just judgment on Jesus. It was Jesus bearing judgment for us. Isaiah 53:5 says, "He was pierced for our transgressions. The punishment that brought us peace was on him. The wrath that should have fallen on us fell on him." The centurion believed. A foreigner sees the truth. Matthew 27:54 describes what happened next. When the centurion and those with him who were guarding Jesus saw the earthquake and all that had happened, they were terrified and exclaimed, "Surely he was the Son of God." This is astonishing. The first person to publicly declare Jesus as the Son of God after his death wasn't a disciple, wasn't a priest, wasn't a Jew. It was a Roman soldier, a Gentile, a man who had likely overseen many crucifixions before. What moved him to speak these words? He saw the darkness cover the land. He felt the earth quake beneath his feet. He witnessed the way Jesus died, not with curses, but with forgiveness and love. It broke something open in his heart. This moment fulfills a powerful Old Testament hope that one day the nations would come to recognize the true God. In Malachi 1:11, God says, "My name will be great among the nations." And Isaiah 49 verse 6 speaks of God's servant being a light to the Gentiles. That prophecy was already starting to come true, not after the resurrection, but at the very moment of Jesus' death. The centurion's confession is a preview of what Paul describes in Philippians 2:10-11. One day every knee will bow and every tongue confess that Jesus is Lord. But for this soldier, the truth had already dawned. It's a reminder that God's grace can reach anyone, no matter their background, culture, or past. Sometimes those farthest from God are the first to recognize Him. The women watched. The faithful few remained. While the disciples had scattered, a small group remained near the cross. Matthew 27:55-56 tells us that many women were there, watching from a distance. They had followed Jesus from Galilee to care for His needs. These women had walked with Jesus for years. They had listened to His words, supported His ministry, and now, in His final moments, they didn't run away. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, and Salome. Their presence speaks volumes. In the Old Testament, women often played key roles at turning points in Israel's story, like Miriam, Deborah, Hannah, and Ruth. But they were rarely seen as central figures by society. Yet here at the cross, they are the faithful witnesses, not the powerful men, not the priests or scholars. It's deeply moving that they stayed to the end. They didn't fully understand what was happening, but their love kept them close. And because of that faithfulness, they would also be the first to witness the resurrection. Matthew 28:1-10. God honored their loyalty. This moment is a quiet rebuke to the world's values. In God's kingdom, faithfulness matters more than fame. Presence matters more than position. And often those the world overlooks are the ones God chooses to reveal His glory. These 6 profound events that follow Jesus' death reveal how the world and the entire universe responded to His sacrifice. These signs are not mere miracles, but witnesses to deep spiritual realities. The death of Jesus was the moment when God's will was fully realized in history. Each of these events uncovers new facets of God's plan for humanity's salvation. The shaking of the earth, the open tombs, the torn veil, the darkness at noon, the centurion's confession, and the faithful women, though they may seem unrelated, ultimately serve one purpose: to show that the death of Jesus was the pivotal moment in the story of salvation. He not only bore the sins of the world, but also opened the way to true and eternal communion with God. Through His death, the barrier between Creator and creation was broken. For us, these events serve as reminders of the significance of what transpired on the cross. We see that in His death, Jesus destroyed the division that had always existed between humanity and God. We can now boldly approach God, knowing that through Jesus Christ, we have access to His presence, and our faith in Him is the foundation of our salvation. Each of these events also reminds us that God's ways have always been directed toward restoration and healing, not only of human souls, but of all creation. Christ came to put an end to sin, but His death also opened the way to resurrection, not only for the faithful, but for the entire universe. In this sense, the cross is the moment when beginning and end meet, when death turns into life and tears into joy. Finally, we see how God pays attention to those whom the world may overlook. The women who stayed at the cross did not fear to be near the crucified teacher. The Roman centurion, often seen as an outsider, was the first to declare Jesus as the Son of God. These details show how God's grace reaches everyone, regardless of social status, culture, or past. In God's kingdom, it is not outward position that matters, but a heart open to Him. Prayer, faith, and love. These are the things that resonate with God. And in conclusion, we can say that Jesus' death was not the end, but the beginning of the greatest renewal. Our hearts and the whole world He created await the full realization of this renewal in His return